So with that, I'd like to introduce Suzanne Williams, who is the co-founder and principal of Mobius Medical. And Suzanne, if you could actually just perhaps start by introducing yourself, giving a little bit of your background and tell us about Mobius Medical, and then we'll be hearing all about clinical trials from an active medical devices perspective.
Certainly can. Hi everyone, it's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. Bit about me, I started off life with a science degree from Manchester University in the UK and found myself in as a monitor for ICON clinical research many moons ago that took me to the States and then down to Sydney to open their, I think now 80 people strong CRO here in Sydney. So my experience spans sort of big CRO to small CRO, big pharma, the likes of Pfizer and Roche, medical devices. My introduction there was Ventricle, which makes LVAD or used to make an LVAD. And then 2008, I co-founded Mobius, having had a few years as a consultant CRA and really enjoyed the medical device space over the pharma. As clinical director now of Mobius Medical, my role is particularly involved, I suppose, in new business and strategic advice for new clients, especially startups in the space. A lot of my day is around proposals, budgets and contracts, liaising with clients for new business and for existing projects and managing those as well alongside my team. And I do wear an HR hat, which is an interesting one, having had no formal training or qualification in that. But as a small business owner, I'm sure many of you know that you have to wear a number of hats in a smaller company until one can hire things like HR managers. And currently I'm also lecturing at the UTS here in Sydney, and I've delivered, I think, the last 5 years of clinical trials for medical devices as part of one of their courses.
Suzanne, Tim here, you threw in a few acronyms there, CRO, CRA. If you
Apologies. The industry is fraught with acronyms. We absolutely get strangled by them. CRO, Contract Research Organisation. So Mobius Medical is a contract research organisation, and that means that we provide clinical trial services for companies that outsource those sorts of requirements. CRA is Clinical Research Associate, and that is the professional, if you like, level, entry level for clinical trials management, so Clinical Research Associate. So learning objectives for today, I'd like to try to explain some of the reasons that clinical trials for medical devices might be done, some considerations around conducting and designing such trials, just a little bit about the law and the rules, because I think it's important that everybody understands the framework that we work under. The main stakeholders, again, it's important to know just roughly who's involved in setting up a clinical trial and managing those, what sorts of things go into and out of a clinical trial, and obviously we'll look at some types of trials along the way, and there's a case study or two at the end. So Mobius is really about helping startup companies develop their products, and the faster we accomplish, especially those early clinical trials, obviously the quicker those sorts of therapeutic goods get to the patients who actually need them. And we work with extremely sick patients needing new cardiac valves, you know, right through to very healthy pregnant ladies who would like a comfier bed. So all manner of products come across our desk pretty much on a weekly basis. We work in first in human, more acronyms, of course, coming up, and I'll try to remember to explain what they are as we go. So first in human devices is pretty much 50–60% of our business. We do much in the work of registration studies or pivotal device studies. Phase 1 pharma, which is things like healthy volunteer studies and pharmacokinetic studies, through to post-market and registry, so that we can, following approval, collect safety data for post-market surveillance on an ongoing basis, and also marketing data, so that companies marketing or marketeers have got some really substantiated science-based claims that they can make. So that's an important aspect of the life cycle, if you like, of medical devices. So clinical trials then has got a pretty messy history until really the last several decades. I'm sure everybody has heard of the atrocious experiments that happened during the world wars. The angel of death, Joseph Mengele, you know, he used to do experiments on twins where he would torture a twin, pour poison in their eyes to try and change the colors, all sorts of things to a twin using their other brother or sister as the control. So horrendous carry on, and I'm sure there are still to this day pretty nasty things going on in you know, communist states and so on throughout the world. But suffice to say, in the Western and developed world, we do have codes and regulations and systems under which we now work. So the main one I want to draw your attention to for Australia is the National Statement. That's available online, and it's essentially the Bible under which the ethics of conducting human experimentation are conducted in this country. All of our ethics committees are registered with Australia's government, and they all have to abide by the National Statement. So it's a pretty in-depth and important document for us in clinical trials. So what are they? Clinical trials essentially are research investigations in which people volunteer to test new treatments, interventions, or tests as a means to prevent, detect, treat, or manage various diseases or medical conditions. The World Health Organization there has a nice catch-all definition, and there's just a list there of some of the interventions that we would run clinical trials using in order to get some of those products onto the approved list for use in a patient setting. I'm sure everybody has heard of a risk analysis, and if you're a medical device company, of course, it will be potentially the bane of your life, but also the most important document. So this slide really just shows what sorts of things are considered when looking at the risk and hazard analysis for a medical product. And as you can see there, clinical trials is one aspect that feeds in to enable us to mitigate or at least characterize certain risks and put some data around those risks in order to satisfy that benefit is particularly, you know, apparent over the risk and whether the risk is permitted or not, I suppose.
Now, Suzanne, Tim here. If you could just go back to that previous slide. Just for the audience, we do with these webinars use a radio interview style where we ask questions. Just as you say, it's an input to the risk analysis. So, you know, my first question for the day, I thought that clinical trials were more about sort of testing other things that you'd already identified. So if there's a usability issue that you've identified and you have come up with a way of testing that, would that testing that usability not be part of the clinical trials, or do you need to have separate trials to test the usability mitigation?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and it, you know, it really depends on who the end user of the device or the therapeutic good is. So usability data is particularly important when the end user is a member of the public. We do need clinical trial results to show that a person using an app or a widget of any description uses it correctly. So yes, usability and human factors can be integrated into clinical trials and needed to prove that something can be used in accordance with its instructions for use. But in some ways, that usability data can be performed outside of a clinical setting as well. If you can show that, if, for example, an app is validated because it produces information that we expect it to produce over and over, then that doesn't necessarily need a human person to try that again in a clinical trial setting, so long as the data suggests that the person can use the app effectively. Does that sort of answer your question?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, just welcome anyone has in the audience have questions. Feel free to type them into the Q&A panel, and I can raise them during the course of the webinar.
So in terms of where we get to in clinical trials, a lot of work must be done before we can start, obviously, testing anything in or on a human being. You know, it depends on the trial, it depends on the device or the tech again. If we have a predicate and we're making something that's similar to another device out there, but it's a little bit better, perhaps uses the same sort of material that it's composed of, you know, we can produce a lot of literature, a lot of data just from what's already in the literature, what's been done. No regulator ever expects any work to be redone, certainly in animals or humans, where we've got good, solid, published data to show that those sorts of data exist anyway. So preclinical is really about literature, what's already been done, and then bench testing. Again, your risk analysis, your quality management system, planning, etc., is going to show, you know, what parts of what components of your device, whether they be electrical or software or materials that something's composed of. A lot of that testing can be done on the bench, and those sorts of data are going to go into your technical dossier. Occasionally, we have to test something in an animal to see if it reacts in the same way that we think, or that we assume it will. And things, again, such as, you know, pigs are used a lot in anything that's topical because our human skin is so closely resembling pig. Sheep, in terms of cardiac valves and so on, are good animal models for those. And all of these sorts of body of work will be summarized in what we call another beautiful acronym, because my circle wouldn't allow the size of the word, but IB is Investigator's Brochure, and it's a very, very important document for R&D teams and engineers and so on to be familiar with, because the investigators.
Suzanne, yeah. I just wanted to quickly jump in and ask another question there. At Genesis, quite often what we find is that when we engage, particularly with something that's coming out of the university, they may have years or even decades of studies that they've already, you know, undertaken to essentially prove the, you know, the efficacy of their device. And I'm just wondering to what extent those are usable or permissible evidence in the going through the regulatory process, or is it that you have to sort of start everything from scratch in this, what you're calling here, the preclinical phase?
No, not at all. That's a good point. Essentially, what the regulatory authority is looking for is a clinical evaluation report, and that's one part, if you like, of the entire technical dossier that gets submitted to a regulatory authority. And the clinical evaluation report is the body of work that's been done, whether it's by somebody else, and therefore we're looking at the literature for and published works that we would summarize in that clinical evaluation report, plus any new work that we might do as manufacturer to show that our device is a bit better or has been made from a better material and so on. So we might do some work that's our own that supports, if you like, other bodies of work. But the clinical evaluation report is the regulatory document that is signed off by an expert in the field and is a fairly sizable, lengthy document containing so much work from others, plus what we've done ourselves, and may or may not include clinical trial data. You know, a number of sort of class 1, class 2A sorts of devices wouldn't even need clinical trial results because the literature and preclinical work is sufficient to show that that device is safe and performs. So the investigator's brochure is different to the clinical evaluation report because it's an early stage document. It's a document that lives and breathes until regulatory approval. So it's part of the investigational document package that contains summaries of everything that we've either seen in the literature on our product or product type, or that we've done that we can now show in our investigators brochure what's been done in a preclinical setting and therefore justify why we're ready to go into the next stage. Investigators brochures tend to be updated annually because on an annual basis, we're continuously doing work on our device and producing more and more data. So that's updated, and an ethics committee would expect to see an update to an investigators brochure pretty regularly so that body of work is continual. So what does that do? So that investigators brochure enables us to go into what we like to call a pilot study. Sometimes people call it a proof of concept. Sometimes it's simply a data acquisition study, where we're gathering some early safety data essentially in a pilot study on a small number of subjects. Obviously, if we've got any risk here, we want to subject as few people as possible to that risk and still progress the development of this device forward. So around 5 to 15 subjects in a pilot study is pretty common. What's vital out of a study like this is usability data, because that enables the R&D team to go back and tweak any device designs. We can also make sure that in our pilot study, we know how patients are reacting or humans are reacting to our device, and any sort of usability aspects that we can improve on, so that when we do the next study for registration and we've got stats to think about and things to prove, you know, we're not coming up against any tweaks that we could have attacked in this stage. A lot of people try and avoid this, thinking it is time and money, you know, that we can just skip and go straight into finding pilot data out of our feasibility or pivotal study, but that's not the case. It's really important to in some aspects, I'm not saying all clinical trials and all tech, it's really important to get those early data and make sure that it talks to our design for our next study. And that leads us into this pivotal stage of design and development here. This is tending to now be looking at efficacy and performance. It's still collecting safety data. We're always collecting safety data if applicable on an ongoing basis. Usually, if we can, we'll randomize and we'll control our clinical trial if at all possible. Again, if you're putting a heart valve in somebody, not possible. So what do we do then? Well, we might use a control, which is medical therapy or historical data on a particular cohort of patients, and show that our device improved the health and the mortality, etc., of patients compared to historical controls. So registration or pivotal studies have always got commercial goals in mind as well. It's really important, if we can and if it's relevant, to collect health economic data such as returns to hospital, medication use or lack thereof, because all of those data obviously go towards ensuring that we can get reimbursement and identifying who the payer is at the end of the day. So it's extremely important to collect health economic data as early as possible. Even in pilot stage, we can start collecting that. And then, of course, there's post-approval. So now we're looking at hundreds, thousands of people. Sometimes we'll do a post-approval study to roll out and encourage adoption of our new device. We might be wanting to collect a registry of data that just collects mortality data, for example, or adverse events that are of interest that we can publish against controls or against competitors. We might be looking at adjunct treatments that are different to those that we studied. So seeing what our device in practice does using different sorts of adjunctive treatment regimen. We might be collectively learning across the globe, across all, lots of different usages, doctors, experiences, different races of people and so on. And finally there, as I said earlier, claims for marketing. So we might be looking at a particular endpoint that a marketeer wants to use in order to sell their product more effectively. So when we're developing the clinical investigational plan for our device, there's a number of things that we will take into consideration. And obviously the first one is, what is our thing? What are we trying to study here? A permanent implant, which is active, has some kind of machine learning, is going to be an awful lot different in the design and the components and what we need to think about when we're designing that study than, for example, a stent that we remove after 30 days. Lots more moving parts, lots more, you know, I suppose, areas to kind of fall over in for that first one. Who is our end user? Like I said, is it a healthcare professional that is going to follow an instructions for use document, or is it a consumer that's going to be so that the actual product at the end of the day needs to be tested to make sure somebody of lower IQ, for example, can use it effectively and in accordance with its instructions. What kind of design are we interested in? Like I said before, are we doing an early pilot site type study that we're honing in purely on safety, or are we doing a registration study where we're trying to compare and get a statistically significant result against a competitor? Can we randomize? Can we blind something even better? Can we use a control? And if so, is that a control that's historic and we're just looking at data from the past, or can we control it now with something like medical intervention only? What sorts of endpoints are we looking at? A lot of the time when we're designing a clinical trial, we look at what we actually want to achieve and be able to say at the end of our trial, and then work back to work out, well, what's clinically relevant around that endpoint, what can we measure, and then ensure our endpoints satisfy, if you like, all aspects. It has to be clinically relevant, otherwise, even if we can measure it and show statistical significance, a doctor won't care because it didn't show clinical change. Ethical considerations, you know, we've got a trial ongoing right now, we've got a few actually in acute stroke. So when you've got a life-threatening condition or a patient's unconscious or can't consent, there's all manner of ethical considerations to take into account when designing our clinical investigational plan. Children, who's going to consent for them? Clinical trials usually have a very tight eligibility criteria and only include certain participants into the trial and exclude certain things such as confounding illnesses and so on, so that we have no confounding issues around if our endpoint is due to our therapy or technology or not. The sample size I'll go into a bit later is critical, and it's vitally important when we're doing a pivotal registration study to ensure that our sample size is going to give us a meaningful powered result at the end of the day, but that is the minimum sample size possible so that we're not wasting money on, sample size in clinical trials is one of the huge drivers of cost. So we don't want to do 200 participants in a study if 100 will tell us the answer. Treatment and treatment allocation. We might be doing a study in Queensland and New South Wales, for example, and they've got a slightly different comparator that they use in Queensland Health than we do in New South Wales. It's important to make sure that those comparators are the same in our clinical trial setting because they can alter our results. Randomization. Can we randomize patients into blocks? Can we striate them, or should we striate them into age groups or gender? Sorry? Tim, I can't hear you.
Sorry, by comparator, do you mean the control?
I do,
in a comparator? Yeah.
Yeah.
Or a control treatment.
Exactly, yeah.
Thank you.
And that goes on to the similar sort of thing, different standards of care. Again, you know, if you're doing a global clinical trial, there's going to be quite different standard of care in terms of follow-up of participants or patients. For example, for, you know, cardiac care in South America than there will be in, you know, Stanford or in Australia. Procedural expertise, there's a huge learning curve, and I tried to find the published data for this, but I couldn't find it, but there is published data to show that when you're doing a new procedure of a novel device, there's a big learning curve, obviously, for that proceduralist, and performance and the learning curve are correlated. So if adverse events reduce as proceduralists improve, and performance also improves as that learning curve reduces for those new sorts of procedures. It's important to consider that. I go on to that a little bit later as well. Similar to the standards of care, you know, what concomitant medications and treatments will participants in a clinical trial receive, and can we standardize those so that we don't have certain people on horrible pain medication that mean that our device can't show a pain difference in certain hospital states or countries. And what's available, you know, again, if we've got a rescue medication for a clinical trial that we use in Australia, is that available elsewhere? And if not, the manufacturing company might need to make sure that that particular rescue medication is available elsewhere. So again, there's uniformity across our design.
Suzanne, can I just ask, you mentioned different countries a couple of times. To what extent do you design a clinical trial to really be, say, specific to Australia and for TGA registration as opposed to the requirements that other countries might?
I mean, it really depends on your regulatory strategy, Tim. So Australia is used a lot to get CE mark approval, which is the European registration approval, and they, well, historically, they have permitted wholly Australian data to be used, or clinical trials only occurring in Australia to be used for CE mark or European approval. And then that CE mark on that product that enables supply in Europe can be used to fast track approval in Australia. So if we are designing a clinical trial specifically for CE mark and then eventual TGA approval, for example, then we will be working with competent authorities in Europe to make sure our design meets the needs of that competent authority, and making sure that any European regulations such as privacy and so on are adhered to and also included in our plan. So there are quite a lot of differences. Similarly with the US, yeah, there's different privacy laws and so on over there. So
I've just got a question from Luke Sy, one of another Genesis person. What's the extent of partnership that happens around a clinical trial? E.g., is it typically done as the product owner, hospital/university partnership, working together on the trial, or is it purely conducted by the product owner with, you know, possibly outsourcing the work to somebody like yourself?
Well, yeah, it really depends on, I suppose, where the IP was formed. So if it's out of a university, then the collaborations are going to be quite different to if it's a, you know, a sole person that's had a brainwave and has come up with a device and then wrapped a startup company around it. So it really depends. But I mean, what the important point is, though, that there is close collaboration between a clinician who understands the therapeutic area very, very well and understands the clinical need, the engineer, which can also be obviously the person that's invented the thing or the startup company and the manufacturer around it, and then the investigative site or institution that will actually participate in the trial and produce the data. So I'd say those are the main collaborative bodies that really need to be involved from the outset.
Sure, and I've got a company or a startup I'm working with at the moment, which is essentially a medical professional working in a hospital, and I mentioned the need for the clinical trials, and they said, "Oh, we can do the clinical trials because, you know, we have all our own patients and so forth." And I sort of quickly pointed out that, you know, there's quite a bit to doing a clinical trial. You know, what do you say to, you know, people like that who, you know, do have ready access to their own patients in sufficient numbers to do a clinical trial?
Yeah, I mean, a huge body of clinical trials are done in institutions. They're called investigator-initiated studies, and they may or may not be sponsored or paid for by an external company that's got an interest, or even a uni. They still need to go through, you know, ethics, and a lot of these sorts of investigators who are medical professionals within an institution, they've got a good relationship with ethics. They do know what they're doing. There are some gaps we find as a CRO and clinical trial managers that get missed in terms of following the guidelines to the letter. But really, as long as they're under an ethics committee, which is within their institution, and they're consenting patients and gathering data in under that ethics approval, then, you know, it happens all the time. And it's
Okay.
important work, it's important work, yeah.
Okay, sorry to interrupt mid-flow.
No, please do. It's good information for everyone. So I think I'm on this point, duration of follow-up. This is important too, and needs to really follow what the technology is. So something that's implanted, you tend to follow, ad nauseum for forever, but certainly as a minimum of 2 years is the sort of rule of thumb for safety data, to make sure that in 2 years' time, we've got some solid safety data on that particular technology. If we do have a long duration of follow-up, then the consideration back to the clinical investigational plan is, how do we keep ensuring that patients are compliant and come back and give us that really important data 12 months, 5 years down the track? So things to consider. Obviously, the longer the clinical trial and the more follow-up visits that are involved, the more involvement from the labor of a CRO, costs rise, Data, post-withdrawal or survival data, as we call it, is becoming more and more important. Once a patient withdrew from a study, that was it. But nowadays we're asking for that patients, even if they withdraw from the study, allow their investigator or their treating doctor to just check in on an annual basis and see if they're alive or dead for certain therapeutic areas, because those data are gold, for those longer term mortality studies. Statistical analysis, certainly not my forte, did very badly at this in school, but suffice to say, any experiment, whether it's a clinical trial, investigation, has a hypothesis, and we reject the null hypothesis or we accept it. And that's what the sample size and the power is based on, what difference we're trying to show, how many patients we will need, and what level of differences we're trying to show will all need to be considered if we're doing, that later stage clinical trial and we're actually using statistical methods to analyze our data and produce a powered result. So the international standard for clinical investigations is 14155, and if people haven't had a look at this and they're thinking about clinical trials, it's a nice, fairly easy standard to get your head around. It talks about good clinical practices specifically for devices. It gives in the annex a clinical investigational plan template. So if you follow that and you don't miss anything, you can't really go wrong in designing or in producing a protocol, which is part of that clinical investigational plan. Similarly, there's a template for an investigator's brochure, which is extremely useful when nobody's made one before. Case report forms are the data tools. They are how we assess what patients, who patients are at the beginning with demographic data and so on. Some procedural information might find itself in a case report form, and also the follow-up data. So this is where we gather our performance information or our safety information throughout the clinical trial. And case report forms nowadays obviously all become electronic, and that's an electronic data capture system, or EDC. There's even an investigation report, so the output of the clinical trial, there's a template for that. There's some information about what sorts of things are considered essential documents that we must have to be compliant under the standard, adverse event information, ethics committees' responsibilities, and so on. So it's a really handy document to have. You do have to pay for it, of course, but a nice document to get your head around if you're embarking on clinical trials. So the Australian Register for Therapeutic Goods, as everyone knows, is where goods go once they're registered for use, unless, of course, they're exempt or excluded. Things like mouth guards and so on, or for sleep apnea and things like that are bespoke, are exempt products. But in general, there is a register, and if our product is not on that register in the indication that we're looking at, then it's considered an unapproved therapeutic good. And as such, we must use it or supply it under a clinical trial setting, or there's other avenues, but for the purposes of this exercise, under clinical trial setting. So let's talk a little bit about how that works. In Australia, as I said at the very beginning, in order for us to ensure that human experimentation is controlled and is regulated, we are subject to TGA's oversight. And to comply with the law, the Therapeutic Goods Act, we have to conduct clinical trials in accordance with good clinical practice. We also have to conduct clinical trials under one of two schemes if we're using a therapeutic good that's unapproved. And that is clinical trial notification or the clinical trial approval scheme. So there's only two. The first one, the CTN scheme, is 99.9% of the clinical trials using a medical device. The other one is really more for extremely toxic pharmaceutical molecules and so on. So the CTN scheme, this works, and this is a huge advantage for Australia over many other countries, and a reason that a lot of overseas clients and manufacturers would use Australia, especially to gather early clinical data, is because we don't have a lengthy regulatory approval stage. The notification enables TGA to put the responsibility and the onus for review onto an ethics committee. And all TGA do is get a notification from the sponsor that the clinical trial has received ethics approval, and that the approving authority, which might be university, it might be an institution, has also provided approval for the clinical trial to occur at its facility. I'll go into that as stakeholders a little bit later. But what's beautiful about this is this takes 2 to 3 days for the TGA part of the approval process for a clinical trial to take place, as opposed to 6 months for the likes of FDA at times, depending on the submission of the device. Competent authority approval in Europe takes many weeks into months, so this is a distinct advantage for us. Clinical trial approval scheme is previously known as CTX, and that's when TGA do look at the body of evidence for the clinical trial. They look at the scientific rigor and so on, and they provide approval. So it's similar to FDA's approval for a clinical trial, or competent authorities in Europe approval for a clinical trial, but we don't use them. I've never used CTA for a medical device study in 25 years. So here's where we'll look at stakeholders. There's essentially 4 main players. The sponsor, this is usually the manufacturing company, could be a uni out of which the IP is produced. They pay for clinical trials generally, they provide the technology or the widget that's under investigation for free. So they are paying, indirectly, if not actually paying for labor. And they're responsible for designing the clinical investigation and for ensuring that the quality of both the product and the management processes. So having a quality management system and good processes in place there. Human Research Ethics Committee. God, I didn't realize how many acronyms we do have. So the HREC reviews, approves and oversees clinical trials from both an ethical perspective, but also in Australia from a scientific rigor perspective. And they ensure the safety, rights and well-being of all study participants are paramount. So they'll look at the design and make sure we have got enough participants to answer our question, but not more participants than necessary, putting more people at risk and those sorts of things. They hone in on the patient information sheet and the consent form and make sure it follows a very strict template that is produced under that national statement that I talked about earlier. Make sure it contains all the elements that the national statement require. The investigator, so could be a doctor, could be a physio, could be a dentist, depends on the therapeutic area, of course, but they recruit the participants. They consent them and they treat them, and they assume all medical responsibility for the safety reporting. And it's also their responsibility to ensure that quality data is provided back to the sponsor. And then finally, the institution is the physical location where the participants will be treated. Might be a hospital, might be a GP rooms, but they are a signatory on the clinical trial contract. and they ensure that there's an insurance policy. So if anything goes wrong under that contract, they're indemnified, and any litigation is essentially back to the sponsor to be dealt with under the clinical trial insurance policy. So in the institution, for the purpose of this talk, we're talking about active medical devices. It's important to know all the different departments that might be involved in our clinical trials, such as biomedical engineering, if we've got something that we're plugging into an ICU in a hospital, for example. I said earlier, the national statement, there's a link at the bottom of this slide to that document. That's our Bible, as well as ICH Good Clinical Practice, and also 14155, which is the standard specific to devices. In Australia, we must get ethics approval before we do anything with a human participant of a clinical trial. We must have informed consent. We must have safety reporting and ways in which safety reporting is done. For example, collection of adverse events, overview of laboratory reports, and oversight of any imaging if applicable. There has to be quality, so documents are to be version controlled. We must ensure compliance to the clinical investigational plan, so we monitor it. We have to ensure that the integrity of the data is there and there's transparency over where that data has come from. Again, that's done by a CRO such as Mobius, monitoring that data against source information and making sure there are no errors. Scientific rigor, sample size, patient population, who are we studying, are they valid? And what are our endpoints? Are they clinically important and measurable at the end of the day? And capabilities, it's no good of involving a hospital in a study that needs an MRI at day 30 when the hospital doesn't have an MRI or access to one. So we need to make sure that the capabilities are in place and reported upon at the beginning of a study. It's all part of good clinical practice. So some of the inputs and outputs involved in trials. So the first thing that we ever want to get together is an ethics and site approval package. The clinical document package involves the clinical investigational plan, sometimes called a protocol or one and the same, investigator's brochure, which I've talked to, case report forms, those data collection tools, information and consent, any other patient documents such as questionnaires that we might want a patient to complete. If someone's got an active implant, they tend to have an emergency or wallet card, radiation report if we're exposing patients to any further imaging for our clinical trial and standard, biomedical engineering approval of our product to make sure that it actually can be used in the facility. So that actually needs to be reviewed and approved by ethics. Then there's two prongs to an approval to start a clinical trial. The one is the ethics approval, and the second is the institution approval, and they sign the contract, the clinical trial agreement. And in that, there's a budget, and the budget usually is for out-of-pocket expenses that the site might have, such as imaging, such as laboratory tests, such as pathology, and so on. It might have time in there for an investigator to consent and to collect data, and that tends to be written into per patient, per visit budget. And then there's an indemnity document and an insurance policy that is for the life of the clinical trial. Internal documents for the company, the manufacturer or the uni or the holder of the technology, quality management system, and a set of standard operating procedures. Plans such as a project management plan, a monitoring plan, safety plan, and a data management plan. All of those things obviously are things that we produce as a CRO for a company. They wouldn't be expected to know what they are, but they would be expected to have them, or their CRO does. Stats analysis plan. Are we doing an interim analysis? If we are, does it affect our final analysis? Because are we having to be unblinded and potentially alter things? EDC, electronic data capture build. So the manufacturer is going to be responsible for the database that houses all the data. Is it validated? In other words, what we put in is that, are we confident that it's the same as what we're going to get out? There are no bugs in the system and so on.
Can I just ask, when you mentioned the manufacturer then, that's, the
That's the sponsor, yeah.
of the product.
Exactly. And
is that not something that the CRO would offer to do, is to?
Yeah, you've got to think of the CRO, Tim, as the extension of the sponsor, because the CRO isn't a stakeholder per se. The sponsor is the stakeholder, and then they outsource some work to the CRO. So CRO sponsor sort of interchangeable. So the CRO, for example, will provide an EDC to the sponsor.
But in terms of regulatory approvals, it's the manufacturer or the sponsor who's ultimately responsible for making sure that data is properly managed through their. So I presume there'll be some sort of quality agreement between the manufacturer and the CRO.
Yes, exactly right.
All of this, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So investigator site documents, things like CV, training, monitoring reports, who the investigator delegated to certain tasks, those sorts of documents are collected before, during, and after a clinical trial. And the sponsor has their set of documents to make sure that they're called essential documents, and they are listed in the standard and in good clinical practice. And we, as sponsor, we have a copy of all of those, and as the investigator, they have like a mirror image, if you like. And visit reports are really important because they're the insight into what a monitor, for example, has found at a site and reports back to the sponsor and resolves as part of an ongoing sort of quality for your clinical trial. So outputs of trials, so at the site level where the study's actually taking place, they'll have their body of source data of the very first place that they collect information. They'll have the signed consents, which are obviously private documents because they contain patient information that in most clinical trials is not to be sent off-site. We must protect the identity of clinical trial patients, and so signed consents and such like stay at the site. Medical records, of course, lab reports, imaging, and then their investigator file of those essential documents. So they are all held at site, and at the end of the clinical trial, they'll all be archived. They're not just thrown away, they're archived usually for 15 years under TGA, but some sites have different regulations. So the sponsor output, so they're going to hold the data. And that might be from product. So your product might have its own software component that houses a huge data set. So obviously that's manufacturer's data. And from the trial database, or our EDC. And we produce at Mobius an EDC that gives listings, reports, tables, and so on in any format that a statistician would be used to. And that enables those data to be analysed and presented in a regular fashion in the report at the end of the day. So the clinical study report, that's the end result of the clinical trial, and that's usually 40 to 140 pages long, contains information on how we manage the clinical trial through all the results and a conclusion and discussion, of course, like any experiment. Audit reports, if applicable. At Mobius, we always do one audit in a year to make sure that all documentation and all processes have been conformed by. And then there's the trial master file, which is, again, archived for a period of time, usually 15 years, which contains all the essential documents in accordance with good clinical practice. Okay, so a little bit on cost drivers. Sample size, like I said earlier, is the big one. The number of patients drive costs. If we've got lots and lots of patients, we usually need more than one site to enroll those patients, given Australia particularly isn't fabulous for population size as a rule. And per patient costs as well are going to obviously drive overall study costs up. Finally, the more patients that we've got, the more data that we've got, and the cleaning exercise and the analysis of those data obviously increase with our sample size. Risk and complexity, again, something high risk. Active implantables, for example, are going to have a huge more body of work and complexity involved than, you know, a class 2A. So it takes a lot longer to get the preclinical requirements done, your risk analysis to a point where we're ready for humans, and then the study design and time to finalize the investigational plan can be longer, obviously, involving valuable time if the complexity of the study is higher. Insurance policies are usually much more expensive the higher the risk. Also, a complex study that's got lots of components to it and so on does tend to get scrutinized and many more cycles of review by an ethics committee until everybody's happy, and that takes time and money. Timelines are important for cost. Most important thing is to get our first data as quickly as possible. So site activation is crucial and the bane of our lives at Mobius, because one thing we can't control is the speed of an ethics committee's review, and we can't control the speed of a big hospital's governance department to sign off. So recruitment period for timelines, absolutely crucial. Nearly always fall down on it. Everybody promises the world, and we nearly always go over the recruitment timeline that we hoped to comply with. Time to the final data point. So this is essentially all encompassing first patient in to last patient out, and encompasses that recruitment period and the follow-up. So if the follow-up's extremely long, out to 5 years, the time before we can finish our study is obviously longer. What's important is to have an efficient data lock and report at the end. So we tend to clean data all the way through a study. So by the time we reached our last patient out, we've only got a very small amount of data cleaning to do, and we can lock our database up as quickly as possible. Geography, site location, you know, it's going to drive cost if we've got sites all over the place and we've only got a handful of people to look after those sites. So they're flying all over the place. Patient density, important with that recruitment period. Where are our experts, and how easy or difficult and expensive is it to meet with them and gain their knowledge and experience. And lastly, for geography, case support needs. So if every time we do a clinical trial, we need case support there, and the geography means we've got cases going on all over the place, that's going to drive cost. So some ways we can reduce this. So again, back to sample size, it's important to get, I think, 2 opinions on the sample size, because some statisticians say we need 140 patients and they give you the reasons and the justifications why, and someone else might say we can do it in 100. And one needs to really ascertain why those differences are there and make sure that if we can possibly go with 100, we will, but we do not risk our power. So it's contentious, to say the least. There are lots of different statistical methods out there, and I'm certainly not an expert and do rely heavily on a biostatistician. So how do we reduce cost for risk and complexity? We ensure that we've got expertise around the regulatory component. How we design and develop our study is really driven. I mean, we rely heavily on our partners, Brandwood, to provide us with a very robust regulatory strategy so that we know exactly what a regulatory body wants to see out of our clinical trials. It's crucial at the beginning. We factor in quite a lot of lead time to talk with our scientific advisory board, our key opinion leaders, usually extremely busy people. You know, you can lose weeks trying to get people to just look at a clinical trial protocol and agree on one thing. So keep it in mind. Timelines, robust clinical package means that we can try and get that crucial early site activation. No good putting an investigator's brochure that's unfinished to an ethics committee, because they will throw it back at us and say, we're not happy, we don't think you've got justification to go into humans yet, even though you say you're partway through the last part of this. Really have to have a robust clinical package that an ethics committee can approve. Thorough site qualifications, making sure our sites know what we want of them. what capabilities we expect of them, how much we're going to pay them, because we can lose months if we go through ethics and get to the crucial end where a clinical trial agreement's being signed and the site goes, oh, I wanted twice the money to do this study. We can't do it for that. I'm sorry, you just wasted your time. Hugely important to qualify them well at the beginning. Understanding ethics process and that's activation timelines. A lot of big teaching hospitals like the Alfred or St. Vincent's in Sydney here have monthly meetings. When we're planning, we want to know when their deadlines are. We don't want to think, right, we're ready to submit to ethics and the deadline was yesterday. Lose a month. Consider flight costs, COVID. Can we even get to clinical sites if there is another, border shutdown, for example? Things to consider when it comes to geography. Local support, again. If we've got a site in Perth that's put in one patient in our clinical trial, it's going to cost us an awful lot to send a monitor out there and a field engineer. Is it really worth it? So things to consider. So I've got a few.
Sorry, can I just ask a quick question on that?
Yeah.
If you're doing a specific device with a specific, like for example, something in a maternity ward, an application in maternity or something. Why is it that you would need to do it in multiple hospitals, in multiple states or multiple countries, rather than just proving it in one place?
Purely on patient recruitment, really, Tim. So it depends on how many patients are coming through with the indication or the thing that we want to treat or diagnose in a particular site. So that's all discovered in the qualification stage or the feasibility stage. If we can recruit the sufficient number of patients that our sample needs in one site, we stick to one site. If we need 5 so that we can do recruitment 5 times faster because we've got 5 sites, we probably want to go down that route. So it's purely on, can we recruit in one site?
Okay, thank you.
I'm going to speed up a little bit because I know I've gone over my hour. So top 10 points to consider. That these are some of the pitfalls or things that I wish we'd sort of thought about 15 years ago. Timing of design and the R&D stage. Are we at a stage with our preclinical and bench work to satisfy the investigator's brochure, really? Have we got an investigator's brochure that's in line with our clinical trial start? Our plan might say we want to start a clinical trial in April, and the R&D team say we are nowhere near producing our prototype till May. So things to consider there, really important. Top level budget. Can we get a clinical trial insurance policy and how much is it going to cost us? How much is our ethics and governance? Generally, you're looking at 10 grand a site, so factor that in to your budget. CRO, anything from 100, 200,000 for a pilot study for CRO, high labor costs to, things can cost $500,000 to run in a big pivotal study with 200-300 patients. Labs, core labs, logistics all cost lots of money. Patient recruitment, can we advertise, or is recruitment likely to be a problem? It's the biggest fail in clinical trials is meeting our recruitment targets. Site setup and per patient payments to site. It's important to know how much our per patient payments are going to need to be in order for investigators to be interested in doing our study and factor all of those into our budget. So clinical trials cost a lot of money. Things that people forget are things like patient reimbursement. So a lot of patients are out of pocket if they're in a clinical trial because we want them to come back and see us more regularly, for example. So they expect for things like taxis, parking and that to be reimbursed. When you're doing that per patient per visit and you don't remember it, it can cost a lot of money. Recruitment goals, overall timelines. All I can say is remember how hard recruitment can be and how it can really affect our overall timelines. It's the biggest stress. If we can advertise and if we can decentralize and encourage participation from patients in other states, for example, by telehealth, and advertise for them to participate in our trial, and go to their local GP, you know, can we? Consider private system over public. So in the private sector, we've got a private ethics committee called Belbury. They are 10 times faster because they meet weekly, because they have 8 committees, compared to a big institutional review board in St Vincent's Hospital in Sydney that has 1 committee that meets monthly. So you can imagine how much faster the ethics process is in the private system. Governance in a GP rooms, that's the private rooms. Governance is the PI, is the principal investigator signing off as both doctor and institution. It's an instant thing. In the Alfred Hospital in Melbourne or Monash, it can be 3 months to get that contract signed, purely because of the amount of research they're having to look over and sign. Case support, big thing in devices, big thing in active devices. Is it required? Do we want somebody from the sponsor company proctoring or supporting, or an engineer there to troubleshoot every single case? If so, factor it in. Where's my number 6? Radiation exposure. This sometimes gets forgotten until it's asked for. And so if our clinical investigational plan needs imaging of patients over and above standard of care, then we need a physicist report to review that and to produce their safety report for ethics. Departments within an investigational site, are they capable of doing the study? Again, an example, biomedical engineering department, will they and can they approve the safe use of something electrical? Many times that approval is used for ethics. And if it's not for ethics, it's definitely for the institutional level approval. Are there any delays there? It's important to factor that in when you're qualifying a site, because every hospital's biomedical engineering department is different. Data. Again, in active medical devices or those with software, there's all manner of data sources. And what we want to do when we're planning our clinical trial out is make sure that our data sources can talk to each other and are secure and are compliant, privacy is protected and so on, access into them is restricted, audit trails, it's transparent. Patient data in terms of demographics, health X, protocol deviations and so on, all of those data tend to be held in an EDC that's made, for example, by us or by the sponsor, whereas you know, your widget, your software data set, it will be different and separated. So can we combine them and can we have one overall source of data? It's a huge one, that, and it's very, you know, technology and clinical trial specific. Device deficiencies, ensure they're well captured. A lot of companies think, oh, I'm just going to capture that through my quality management system, and it doesn't wind up in the clinical trial data set. That's problematic when we come to report at the end. So I always say, can we please have a case report form that captures data around any deficiency so we can report really clearly on it at the end. And then training, that learning curve I told you about earlier about the safety and performance data is well established. So if there is a brand new procedure or a brand new piece of kit that you're asking an investigator to use, do we need animal or cadaver procedure training before, so that they've used the thing before, for example, an open heart surgical procedure? Should we have a lead-in cohort? This is quite important. For example, 5 patients who are not included in our eventual performance analysis, because we know that those data are going to be pretty sketchy compared to when the procedure training and the learning curve's reduced. Do we need field engineers on site? Do we need proctoring? That means usually by a physician, and if so, who can do that? If they're an overseas doctor, there's all manner of issues in accrediting them in many hospitals in Australia. So things to consider. I can go into these in huge amount of detail. I won't now, but I'm always here if anybody has any more questions. So other things about particularly active medical devices, you know, there are so many moving parts, aren't there? And one can fail. For example, our software doesn't do what we thought it was going to do and needs a firmware or a hardware component update or electrical component update. And so all moving parts can have to be altered just for one. It's extremely important to have such a deep level of project planning in the R&D stage, and make sure that certain endpoints are identified, work back and figure out what components of our technology intertwine, what clinical evidence can be gathered individually, simultaneously as a total system, and factor all that into the planning at the very beginning. There's many standards involved, and some widgets and things have got standards that are well defined. Some very novel products, one has to interpret a standard that's similar. And also, as I said earlier, with the data, one interface, if possible, for planning the entire system that gathers data. Right from the inexpensive methods through to more expensive, data gathering exercises, so that we can not embark on something that's going to cost us a bomb when we could have perhaps done an inexpensive clinical trial or bench work to make sure that that particular component is working and is validated before we move on. I think I've talked to these throughout the presentation today, but major fails: inadequate investigators brochure or clinical investigational plan, meaning we get rejection by the ethics committee. If we get rejected, it's extremely hard to come back. We avoid that by all costs, and we usually get a conditional approval based on certain questions being answered by the ethics committee. Obviously, the biggest fail is insufficient funding and running out of money halfway through and having to pull the trial. Slow or lack of recruitment and or poor compliance, and therefore we don't get important data down the track. It can cause a failure to our clinical trial. Worst thing of all, of course, our thing doesn't work. Identifying differences in patient management, and therefore our clinical trial has confounding issues in there, usually resulting in poor quality data and statistical analysis at the end. Lack of resources becoming more and more important, especially in COVID days, where people, can't get to work, and therefore interest wanes. For example, sometimes a principal investigator even steps away and doesn't have an alternative, and our clinical trial will just have to get pulled. And again, over here on the far right, the worst thing of all is we find that our thing is unsafe and we have to stop our clinical trial prematurely. Nearly done, everyone. I'm wondering how, Tim, you think we're going for time. I'm over.
Sorry, I'm muting myself here. Yeah, look, I know you've only got another couple of slides, so if you could just breeze through this as quickly as you can, that'd be great. Okay. So a case study is a neurostimulator, and it's got an edge to other competitors on the market. So I'm just going to look at this and think about a few things which are repeated on this slide. So let's not hone in there. So first thing I'm going to consider, is there a predicate? This is the most important thing. If there is, we're away and dancing. We're going to have literature, we're going to have clinical trials that we can copy, we're going to have a body of work that's behind us, and therefore we won't have to repeat. Of course, if there isn't, we have to do all of that body of work. So my goal, what is my goal when I'm looking at this neurostimulator case study with an edge? So all I want to do is I want to gain European and Australian approval for my system. That's my goal. And my endpoint is going to be designed around that. My widget is largely a similar device to what's on the market, but my edge is the only thing I have to prove. And my endpoint is going to be designed around my edge. What difference, and whether there's any differences in, for example, in this particular instance, pain relief that my edge gives. My goal is also to increase market awareness for commercial readiness, because I'm going to be very close to regulatory approval. So I want to get my thing out into the hands of investigators and doctors. So I'm going to design my trial. For the European market, I'm going to need 2 years of safety data, and I know that, so I'm going to factor that into my study. I'm going to show substantial equivalence for efficacy on everything, and I'm going to have my primary endpoint as the edge. So that's the thing I'm going to show, and then I'm going to show that everything else to do with my device is as good as my competitors.
I need to understand the clinical relevance then. So I'm going to know who my competitors are and do a damn fine literature search on what they are, what they've done, and what they've got published in the literature. And I'm going to show clinically meaningful differences. I'm going to consult clinicians. I'm going to consult my medical advisory board. I'm going to say, is a visual analog scale difference of two out of 10 meaningful to you? And they're going to say, yes, it is. It's hugely meaningful. And that's where I'm going to have my endpoint. Where will I conduct this sort of a trial? I'm going to go to the top implanters because I want absolute quality data and I don't want anybody with poor procedural technique implanting my device. I'm also going to need lots of patients, so I need the most densely populated cities. These two usually go hand in hand, of course. So the procedure is not new, it's easy to teach. And my goal really is speed and quality of data. But I do need research experience in order to ensure that. My budget, I'm going to look at 50 patients because my sample size to show my edge endpoint says I need 50. To do that, I'm going to look at 5 sites and 10 patients per site, and I'm going to need around $500,000 for this study. I'm going to make sure I've got contingency money just in case I have any unexpected serious adverse events. Anybody needs an explant, for example, I'm going to be able to cover those costs. I'm going to think about where my patients are coming from. For this, they're existing paying patients, but I might also get referrals and drop-ins. Can I advertise for those referrals and drop-ins? If possible, I want to reduce my recruitment period. Can I stick to the Eastern Seaboard because my company's got field engineers there? So therefore, I'm going to reduce my costs to support those sites. And I'm also going to get myself a good local medical devices CRO because I want good site management. I want an electronic data capture tool, and I want analysis and safety oversight because this is going for European approval. I'm now looking at a study with an approved STIM, and all it's got is some software updates. What are my considerations now? So I want to design a rolling investigation. Everything to do with my device and my system's approved, so it's going to be used in a commercial setting. I'm going to develop an open protocol design where I'm going to say my protocol, as new software features become available, I'm going to roll them out. I'm not particularly going to list those features out in my protocol if I can avoid it. I'm literally going to say software updates. If I do have to do major changes, I'm going to rely on an amendment, but I'm going to start my protocol in that manner so I can get going and start testing these new features as the engineers of my company become available. Is my investigator's brochure relevant? Well, mostly no if it was about the system, because now the only investigational product is my software. So what I want to do is reference the Australian Register for Therapeutic Goods for all the approved product and only hone in as an investigator's product, investigational product for my software. But I still need one. Who's funding this? Well, my system's commercially available, so insurers and hospitals are going to fund it, but I'm going to, as sponsor, going to fund the investigation. And I'm going to give some form of reimbursement to patients because they're going to have to give me an hour of their time on top of standard of care. And I'm going to have to pay my investigator a little bit for data entry. Has this got to be done under a clinical trial notification? Yes, it does, because I'm using software that's not on the ARTG and therefore it's an unapproved medical device. I'm also going to need an insurance and indemnity for it. I'm going to conduct this at my busiest sites. Remember, it's commercially available. The research resource is less important. My data is very, very low labor. In fact, my engineers are going to take a lot of the workload. I'm going to have a real commercial focus on this. I want my product to get into the hands of as many doctors as I can. I'm going to have my engineers do all the work. And as long as I've got a principal investigator with good clinical practice knowledge, I'm happy. Yes, they are involved. My marketeers are hugely involved because they're actually driving the clinical trial. So that's any questions on that I will deal with later. So recap then, I think we've understood some of the reasons about clinical trials and considerations that we have to take when conducting and designing them. We've talked about the law, national statement, the rules, GCP, clinical trial notification. We've talked about the stakeholders, what goes in and out of a trial. And I think I have explained different types of clinical trials, albeit there are obviously infinite numbers and types. I don't know whether we've got time for questions, but I'm more than happy to receive your emails. Love to hear from anybody that's got questions or comments on the presentation today.
Well, thank you very much, Suzanne. And we do still have about 90% of the audience present, but I can see that a few are rapidly dropping off as we speak. But yeah, if there are any questions, I think, Jeff, a few thank yous. Thanks, Natalie, and a few other people said thank you very much, very insightful. Jeff Sizer asked a question that I think is more or less the same as I asked earlier on. Early stage developers sometimes say they are doing, in quotes, clinical trials using proof of concept medical devices not developed under design controls. And I warn them that the results may not be accepted by regulators. What is your experience with this? And
yeah, that's right. So that's fine, but any changes to the technical aspect of the product must be validated or proven. So occasionally iterations, don't need particularly clinical trial data. They can be explained or justified by bench testing. But in general, we want to get a device as close to what's going to be manufactured as possible for our registration study. It's fine to do pilot and proof of concept work on early iterations, but it's important to really concentrate your registration pivotal study on something that's had a design finalization or close to it.